Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases in West Virginia's history. Before we start, please leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. We want to know where and when these written accounts are getting to. Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, 1896, is a town with a troubled past that goes back further than John Brown's famous raid. It is located where the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers meet, in the shadow of the Blue Ridge Mountains. A time when the sound of steam engines echoed through the valley, and the Civil War was still fresh in people's minds. The Blackwood sisters ran what locals called the best boarding house in the county from this white clapboard house that looked out over the rivers. The mysterious disappearances that plagued the establishment were only matched by their reputation for hospitality. These disappearances would not be linked until decades later. According to county records, at least 7 people who stayed at the Blackwood house between 1892 and 1896 were never seen again. However, their things would sometimes show up again. A pocket watch here, a pair of glasses there, always in the hands of one of the 3 sisters who ran the place. When asked, they said that guests often left early, sometimes before dawn, and left their belongings behind as payment for debts. The local sheriff, Thomas Harlow, who was married to one of the sisters' cousins, never looked into these things any further. The story of the Blackwood sisters stayed hidden in courthouse archives until 1953, when Professor James Whitaker of Georgetown University found a bunch of ledgers while doing research for his book about trade in the Shenandoah Valley after the Civil War. What he discovered led him down a path that the government would close off in 1968, after he mysteriously disappeared. The following is a story put together from old documents, newspaper articles, and interviews with people who lived in Harpers Ferry during those 4 years. The records tell a story of loneliness, hopelessness, and the worst kinds of human need, where hospitality hid planned malice, and a good meal was often the start of something much worse. The Blackwood family had been in Jefferson County for a long time, since the early 1800s. Jeremiah Blackwood, a merchant from Baltimore, bought 20 acres of land in 1823. This land included the plot where the house would later stand. The land deed records show this. The deed, which is kept in the county archives, calls the property a superior parcel, with great views of the river junction and easy access to the main road. Jeremiah's business records, some of which are still in the Jefferson County Historical Society collection, show that he ran a successful dry goods store on Shenandoah Street, bringing in high-quality fabrics and household goods from cities in the East. Records from St. Peter's Catholic Church show that the Blackwoods were important members of the church and helped a lot with the building of a new church in 1833. The minutes of ladies' auxiliary meetings often mention Jeremiah's wife, Catherine, as someone who organized charity drives for the poor and social events for important families. Tax records from 1840 show that the Blackwoods owned more than just their original property and store. They also owned a small farm outside of town and several rental properties along High Street. Jeremiah Blackwood was one of the most important merchants in the growing river community, according to a business directory published in Baltimore in 1842. His store sells high-quality goods to the wealthy families of Jefferson County. They sent their son William, who was born in 1821, to school in the East. He first went to a preparatory school in Philadelphia, and then to Harvard College, where records show he graduated in 1842. As his father got older, William went back to Harpers Ferry and slowly took over running the family businesses. William got all of the family's property when Jeremiah died in 1852. By that time, it was one of the largest private fortunes in Jefferson County. William's 1853 marriage to Elizabeth Hollister brought together 2 important families in the area. A small notice in the Virginia Free Press said that the wedding was attended by the most important people in the area, including members of the famous Washburn, Stower, and Lockwood families. People said that Elizabeth was a well-educated lady with a lot of money. She went to the exclusive Troy Female Seminary in New York. The couple set up their home in the family home that looked out over the rivers. William had done a lot of work on it after his father's death. Building permits filed with the county show that the house will get a lot bigger, including a 3rd floor, a bigger kitchen, and updated plumbing things that were not common at the time. People say that the Blackwoods lived the life that was expected of the rich in the area. They hosted dinners, went to church, and took part in the social events that wealthy families had every season. Their first daughter, Margaret, was born in 1854. Eleanor came next in 1858, and Ruth came last in 1863. Street. Peter's baptismal records show that each child was baptized with a lot of ceremony and that godparents were chosen from the most important families in the area. According to school records, the girls learned from private tutors who were brought in from Baltimore and Philadelphia. This is another sign of the family's wealth and status. The Civil War changed everything for the Blackwoods, just like it did for a lot of other families in the border states. William Blackwood made a life-changing choice in April 1861. He had gotten the family land from his father in 1852. When Virginia voted to leave the Union, Jefferson County, which would later become part of West Virginia, was very divided. William went to northern schools and had a lot of business interests in Baltimore and Philadelphia. He chose to support the Union. In July 1861, military records show that William Blackwood was given the rank of lieutenant colonel in the 2nd West Virginia Volunteer Infantry. He had a great service record. He fought in the Shenandoah Valley campaigns under General Sheridan and was hurt at the Battle of Cedar Creek in October 1864. William's letters to Elizabeth, which are now in a private collection that was given to the West Virginia State Archives in 1947, show how he was struggling inside. I cannot in good conscience support the dissolution of our great republic, though I know my position places you and our dear children in a difficult position among our neighbors. I pray that when this conflict ends, reconciliation will be possible. The letters also show that the Blackwood businesses suffered a lot while William was away. In a letter from June 1863, he says, "Your report of the store's declining trade pains me, though I understand that many who once counted themselves our friends now take their custom elsewhere. We must endure this trial as we have others, with dignity and patience." By 1864, things had gotten worse. A letter from September says, "I am sorry to hear that the rental properties are now empty and that you had to let the household staff go. Please tell Martha and Joseph that they will be welcome back when things get better." During the war, Harper's Ferry changed hands many times. Both Union and Confederate troops used the important town. At different times, the Blackwood home was used as officers' quarters because it was in a good spot with a view of the rivers. A damage claim made to the federal government in 1866 says that the property was badly damaged, with furniture being destroyed, walls being defaced, windows being broken, and troops from both sides stealing household items. But his return home was not the happy ending he had hoped for. People in the area were very pro-Confederacy, and people who supported the Union were often seen as traitors. The Blackwood family became outcasts in a community they had once helped build. Reverend Samuel Woodson, the pastor of the Presbyterian church that the Blackwoods had been going to for generations, wrote in his journal in September 1865, "Colonel Blackwood attended services today for the first time since his return. Several families rose and departed when he entered. His wife appeared distressed, but the colonel himself maintained his dignity. The 3 daughters sat very still, like little statues. One wonders what effect this treatment will have on such young minds." The exclusion went on for years. Business records from that time show that local store owners often charged the Blackwoods more or refused to give them credit that was usually given to other families in the same social class. People stopped sending you invitations to social events. The family that used to be well known became more and more isolated. A diary kept by Harriet Stanton, a neighbor whose family got along well with the Blackwoods, gives us a look at how their social status was getting worse. "Took tea with Elizabeth yesterday. The house, once so full of life and visitors, stands silent now. The girls are growing up without proper society or friends their own age. Elizabeth said they haven't been invited to any of the summer gatherings. The colonel spends his days in his study with his books and his bourbon. One feels the weight of their isolation upon crossing the threshold." Elizabeth Blackwood, the colonel's wife, seems to have been the most hurt by this loneliness. Dr. Theodore Lambert's medical journal from 1872 has many entries about her condition. One says, Mrs. B continues to show signs of nervous exhaustion and melancholia. She says she hears whispers when she is in town and thinks former friends are plotting against the family. The Colonel says she spends whole days in her bedroom with the curtains drawn. Lambert's journal gives a progressive account of Elizabeth's mental health getting worse. April 1873. Mrs. B now refuses to leave the house at all. She has developed strange habits, like checking the locks several times a night. She thinks that neighbors are watching the house from the woods beyond the garden. She has lost a lot of weight because she doesn't want to eat. November 1874. Mrs. B's condition continues to worsen. She now has paranoid delusions about the food in the house. She believes that unnamed enemies are trying to poison the family. She has started making all the meals herself, even though this was previously the job of the household staff. The Colonel says she won't let the daughters eat anything she hasn't made and tasted first. February 1875. The most concerning thing about Mrs. B's case is that she now hears voices telling her to protect her daughters from threats she doesn't know about. She has started sleeping outside their bedroom door. She is not taking care of her personal hygiene very well. We have suggested institutional care, but the Colonel refuses to think about it right now. By 1876, Elizabeth's health had gotten so bad that she could no longer stay at home. The records from Western State Hospital in Staunton, Virginia, show that she was admitted on the 12th of June 1876 with a diagnosis of severe melancholia with paranoid features. The doctor who admitted her wrote, "The patient thinks her neighbors are poisoning her food, and she gets very upset when she eats. She has lost a lot of weight because she won't eat." The hospital's quarterly reports to Colonel Blackwood, witch doctor, Lambert kept in his files, show that Elizabeth's condition didn't get much better over time. September 1876. The patient is still withdrawn and suspicious. They only eat a little bit of food and need to be watched closely to make sure they are getting enough. They won't do occupational therapy or social activities. December 1877. The patient has developed ritual behaviors around eating. They will only eat after carefully preparing and inspecting all of their food. They have accused hospital staff of working with unnamed enemies. They sometimes need to be sedated when they are very agitated. March 1879. No significant improvement. The patient now speaks rarely, even to attending physicians. She still believes she was committed to keep her daughters safe. She asks to see them less often. Elizabeth stayed in an institution until she died in 1883. Hospital records say that she was quiet and didn't talk much while she was there, but nurses said she seemed to get a little better when her daughters came to visit. The Colonel only came to see them twice in 7 years, saying that he couldn't travel more often because he had to take care of the family's property by himself. The death certificate says that Elizabeth died because her health systems failed because she starved herself. This suggests that her fear of food played a role in her death. She was buried in the Blackwood family plot in Harper's Ferry, but funeral records show that not many people came to the service. This is another sign that the family was still socially isolated. During these hard times, the 3 daughters, Margaret, Eleanor, and Ruth, were mostly left to their own devices. Jefferson Academy's school records show that all 3 were very smart, but Margaret was especially good at math and accounting. Her term papers, which are kept in the Academy's archives, show that she was very interested in managing money and making investments, things that young women of the time didn't usually study. Eleanor was good at household arts, as shown by the embroidery she won a prize for at the Jefferson County Fair in 1872. The local newspaper said that her work was very precise and detailed, with stitches so fine that they were almost invisible to the naked eye. Her teachers noticed that she was a perfectionist. One evaluation said, "Miss Eleanor will unpick and restart her work multiple times until she gets the exact result she wants, which is very patient for someone so young." Several teachers noticed that Ruth was good at chemistry. An essay that Ruth wrote when she was 13 and is still kept in the Academy's archives shows that she was very interested in how to prepare and store food, especially meats. The essay, On Modern Methods of Food Preservation and Their Chemical Foundations, shows that she knows a lot more than most students her age. Her science teacher wrote, "Unusually detailed understanding of organic decomposition for a student of her age. Somewhat concerning focus on methods of preserving animal tissue." After their mother was hospitalized, all three girls stopped going to school. Margaret was 18, Eleanor was 14, and Ruth was only 9. The Colonel seems to have thought that homeschooling was better because the family was still socially isolated. He hired a number of tutors, but town records show that none of them stayed for more than a few months. In 1879, Miss Caroline Spencer, one of the tutors, wrote to a friend in Baltimore, "The Blackwood girls are smarter than their years, but there is something wrong with the house. The youngest girl asks questions that no child should think about. The Colonel is often gone, and the house is so quiet that it makes you feel bad. I will not renew my contract when it ends." James Harrison, another tutor, only stayed for 6 weeks before leaving without getting his last pay. He wrote to the headmaster of his old school, saying, "The situation at the Blackwood house is not as represented. The girls, while intellectually capable, display disturbing tendencies. The eldest manages the household accounts with suspicious precision for one her age. The middle child spends hours arranging and rearranging items in the house to achieve some standard of order only she can discern. And the youngest, I cannot adequately describe my discomfort with her preoccupations. She dissects small animals found on the property, claiming scientific interest, but the enthusiasm she displays is most unseemly. The Colonel, when present, is either indifferent or inebriated. I could not in good conscience continue." The Blackwood sisters lived alone more and more for the next 15 years. People who lived nearby said they only saw them at church or when they had to go into town to get things. The family's once large group of friends and family had shrunk to only a few close friends and distant relatives who came to visit from out of town every now and then. Colonel Blackwood's health started to get worse in the late 1882. Dr. Lambert's journal talks about how he treated him for breathing problems and times when he was confused and agitated, especially at night. The doctor's notes from 1890 say that the Colonel is worried about his mental health. Patient believes that former Confederate soldiers are plotting to burn his house. He has started keeping loaded guns in every room. I have told the daughters to keep these guns safe, as the Colonel's hands shake a lot and he may be a danger to himself or others. An especially revealing entry from November 1890 says, "Called to the Blackwood house at midnight. The Colonel had fired his revolver through the bedroom window, saying he saw intruders in the garden. There was no sign of anyone being there." The daughters seemed very calm during the whole thing. The oldest, Miss Margaret, said that these kinds of things were becoming more common and asked about stronger sedatives than I had given her before. The youngest daughter, however, was the most interesting. She watched the whole thing with what I can only describe as clinical interest, as if she were studying her father's decline. There weren't many people at Colonel Blackwood's funeral in February 1891. The obituary in the Jefferson County Advocate was short and only mentioned his time in the military. There was no cause of death given, but Dr. Lambert's private records show that his heart failed, possibly because he had been depressed for years and drank too much alcohol. An unsettling note appears in Lambert's private journal, which was never meant to be read by anyone else. Am not entirely satisfied with the circumstances of the Colonel's passing. Called to certified death in early morning hours. Body already prepared for burial by the daughters, unusual in itself. Miss Margaret cited the Colonel's explicit wishes to avoid unnecessary handling. No obvious signs of violence or self-harm, though the daughter's composure was remarkable for those who had just lost their only remaining parent. When I suggested a more thorough examination might be appropriate, Miss Ruth commented that further invasion of father's dignity would serve no purpose, as what's done is done. The phrasing struck me as peculiar. Have signed the certificate as requested, though certain questions remain. The Colonel's death put his daughters in a bad financial situation. Military pension records show that his Union Army pension ended when he died. Over the years, the family's once large holdings had shrunk as the Colonel sold off properties to pay for their way of life, as his businesses failed. There was only the house on the hill and a little bit of money left by 1891. In 1954, Professor Whitaker found bank records from the Harpers Ferry National Bank that showed the Blackwood account had only $237.42 at the time of the colonel's death. This was not enough money to support 3 unmarried women for more than a few months, even in modest circumstances. But within a year, regular deposits started to come in, and they grew into large amounts that let the sisters not only keep their house running, but also make big improvements to it. Margaret, the oldest and most sensible of the sisters, came up with the idea to turn the family home into a boarding house. In her letter to the Jefferson County clerk, asking for the right business license, dated the 7th of March, 1892, she wrote, "Our location near the railway station and the quality of accommodations we can provide should attract a respectable clientele of travelers requiring temporary lodging. We anticipate primarily serving businessmen and tourists visiting the historical sites of Harpers Ferry." The Blackwood home changed quickly and completely. Local carpenter Joseph Winters was hired to make changes to the inside, turning the large family quarters into extra bedrooms and fixing the plumbing so that paying guests could stay there. His bill, which is still in the county's records, has an unusual item. Miss Blackwood asked for the basement ceiling beams to be strengthened and a special drainage system to be put in. The bill was much higher than what it usually cost to renovate a house at that time, which suggests that the changes were more than what a boarding house would normally need. Later, Winters told his apprentice Timothy Hayes that the work in the basement was strange. Hayes, interviewed by Professor Whitaker in 1954, recalled, "Mr. Winters said it was the strangest job he'd ever done. Said Miss Margaret had very specific requirements. Wanted a drain in the floor that connected directly to the river. Wanted hooks in the ceiling beams that could support substantial weight. Wanted the walls lined with copper sheeting in one section. Said he didn't ask questions because the pay was good, but he never felt right about it." Hayes added a detail that caught Whitaker's attention. "Mr. Winters told me they brought in special equipment from Baltimore, a large cast iron table with channels running to the edges and a drain in the center. Took 4 men to move it into the basement. Miss Margaret said it was for laundry purposes, but Mr. Winters said he'd never seen a laundry table made that way, with restraining brackets along the edges and that particular drainage setup. Said it reminded him more of equipment he'd seen in a slaughterhouse when he did renovation work for the Shepherd family's butcher shop in Charlestown." The Blackwood house was open for business by May 1892. An ad in the Baltimore Sun said it was a great place to stay because it had clean, comfortable rooms and home-cooked meals that were very good. It was also close to the Harpers Ferry train station, so it was easy to get to. You can stay for a week or a month at a time. There were similar ads in newspapers in Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and Richmond, which suggests that the sisters were looking for a lot of guests. The focus of all the ads was the same: great rooms, great food, and the owner's personal attention. One ad in the Philadelphia Inquirer said, "Particularly well suited for gentlemen traveling on business who appreciate fine cuisine and attentive service in a homelike setting." It seemed like the business did very well right away. Tax records show that the sisters made a lot more money in their first year of business. But what's interesting is that this financial success happened even though not many people signed the guest book. Professor Whitaker's notes say that the register showed an average occupancy rate of only 30%, which is too low to explain the reported income. An entry in Margaret Blackwood's private ledger, which was found among the materials sealed in 1968, could explain the difference. A note from September 1892 says, "We have decided that registering all guests officially creates unnecessary paperwork. Only those chosen for special hospitality will be recorded in this private ledger. This should make things easier if questions come up." Almost right away, local store owners started to notice how the sisters bought things. Thomas Wilson's grandfather owned the general store on High Street and kept very detailed records of the sisters' orders. His ledger shows that he bought strange things on a regular basis, like large amounts of lye, specialized knives, multiple sets of fine-bone china that he replaced often, and large amounts of certain spices, especially those that are known to hide other flavors. Wilson told Professor Whitaker what his grandfather had said. Granddad said the Blackwood sisters bought more preserving salt than any family he'd ever seen, even those who were putting up meat for the winter. And they bought it year-round, not just during butchering season. When he asked Miss Margaret about it once, she just smiled and said they had special preservation needs for their kitchen. The Jenkins family's hardware store gave us another piece of the puzzle. Their sales records show that the sisters bought a lot of locks, chains, and heavy-duty restraints that are usually used to keep animals safe. When asked, they said they needed these things to keep the basement storage room safe, where they kept their valuable supplies and family heirlooms. The first known disappearance linked to the Blackwood house happened in February 1893, about 9 months after the boarding house opened. Howard Phillips, a timber dealer from Baltimore, came on February 14th for what was supposed to be a 3-night stay while he worked out how to buy a piece of forest land in the nearby Blue Ridge. The guest register says that he checked out on February 17th after paying his bill in full, but Phillips's family said he was missing when he didn't come back to Baltimore. On February 20, a telegraph was sent to Sheriff Harlow asking for any information about Phillips's whereabouts. The Baltimore Police Archives still have Harlow's response, which said, "Mr. Phillips left Harper's Ferry by morning train on February 17th. According to boarding house owners, there is no more information available." What makes this case so interesting is a note that Professor Whitaker found in Margaret Blackwood's private ledger, which was sealed in 1968. The entry for February 17th says, "Mr. P. paid his bill in full. Personal items of good quality. Ruth was especially happy with the watch fob." Eleanor has claimed the leather satchel for conversion to household use. A more disturbing entry follows on February 18th. Ruth's special preparation most successful. Guests at dinner commented specifically on the tenderness of the roast. Eleanor's new preservation technique appears effective. No detectable odor or discoloration. We'll continue with this method for future special preparations. The banking records for the Blackwood house show a deposit of $243.75 on February 18th, which is a lot more than what a single guest's 3-night stay would have earned in room and board. This pattern of unexpected money coming in after guests went missing would continue while the boarding house was open. The same thing happened when Edward Cartwright, a land speculator from Philadelphia, went missing in June 1893. Cartwright got there on June 10 and was last seen leaving on June 13. His family said he was missing on June 20th after he didn't come home and missed a number of important business meetings. Sheriff Harlow's investigation only took him to the Blackwood house for a short time. There, he believed his cousin's story that Mr. Cartwright had said he would visit properties in the Shenandoah Valley before going back to Philadelphia. There was no more investigation, even though Cartwright's horse and carriage had been sitting at the local livery stable for weeks without being claimed. Margaret's ledger entry for June 13th says, "Mr. C's account settled. Gold pocket watch of superior quality." Eleanor finds his walking stick useful for reaching high shelves. Ruth pleased with the quality of his boots, though too large for any of us. A later entry from June 14th goes into more detail. Ruth experimenting with new marinade for special preparation. Results, excellent. Diners commented that the meat was more flavorful than previous offerings. Must remember, subjects who consume alcohol regularly require additional soaking time to remove bitter undertones. In Margaret's ledger, similar entries would show up every 3 years, always at the same time as guests who were later reported missing. The pattern was always the same. Businessmen traveling alone, with cash, and no ties to the area. They would come, stay for 2 or 3 nights, and then leave early in the morning when no one was around to see them. The sisters' business went on without anyone noticing, thanks to their reputation as respectable spinsters and their family's long-standing, if complicated, place in the community. Widow Harrison, who lived next door to them, later said, "Those girls were so quiet and proper, they always nodded politely when they passed on the street. They kept that house spotless. You could see the windows shining from across the river. I never would have thought they had it in them, but there was something about Ruth's eyes that never seemed right to me, too calculating for a woman so young." Franklin Myers, another neighbor whose property was next to the Blackwood house to the north, told Professor Whitaker, "Sometimes at night I'd hear noises coming from their place. Not like a party or guests talking, more like furniture being moved, heavy things being dragged. And once or twice I could swear I heard a sort of mechanical sound, like a pulley or winch operating. Always late at night, well after decent folks were asleep. I mentioned it to Sheriff Harlow once, but he said the ladies probably just suffered from insomnia and were rearranging their furniture. Myers added a detail he had previously withheld. There was one night, must have been the summer of '95, when I was out late checking on my livestock during a thunderstorm. Saw lights in the Blackwood basement windows, which was unusual at that hour. Lightning flashed, and I caught a glimpse of something through the window that I've tried to forget ever since. Looked like the youngest sister, Ruth, working at some kind of table. She had her back to the window, but I could see she was wearing something like a butcher's apron, all stained dark. There was something on the table in front of her, something large. The lightning stopped, and I couldn't see clearly anymore. Told myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my eyes. Never mentioned it to anyone, until now. The Blackwood sisters stuck to their roles in the business. Margaret, the oldest, took care of all the money and registered guests. Eleanor took care of the linens and cleaning. Ruth, the youngest, was in charge of the kitchen and dining room at all times. This division of labor meant that each sister could run her own area with little help from the others. This would later be important when authorities tried to figure out who was responsible for what. Sarah Jenkins, who worked as a maid at the Blackwood house for a short time in 1894, gave an interview in 1955 that gave us a rare look at how things worked there. The old Jenkins said, "Miss Margaret was always at the desk, watching who came and went. She had a way of sizing up the gentlemen as they arrived, looking at their clothes, their luggage, and their hands. Some she would greet warmly, and others more coolly. The ones she was particularly nice to were always the ones who left early and weren't seen again." Jenkins went on to say, "Miss Eleanor was in charge of the rooms and was very picky about the linens. They had to be perfectly white. Sometimes I would find stains on sheets or towels, and she would take them from me right away and say she would handle them personally. She never let me near the washing when certain items needed cleaning." Jenkins also talked about the strange way Eleanor kept track of linens. She had this book where she wrote down every item, how many times it had been washed, when it had been bought, and when it needed to be replaced. If a sheet or tablecloth had been used for what she called special service, it was marked with a small red thread in the hem. Those items were always washed separately, and Miss Eleanor handled them herself. Jenkins's comments about Ruth Blackwood were the most interesting. Miss Ruth was the strangest of all. She wouldn't let anyone into her kitchen while she was cooking. The food she served looked and smelled great, but some of it had a sweetness that didn't belong or a texture that wasn't quite right. When guests praised her cooking, she would watch them eat with an intense look, not happy, but more hungry. It seems that Ruth was a very good cook. A letter from a guest who left safely in August 1894 talks about how the meals alone are worth the price of lodging. Miss Ruth's roast was unlike anything I've ever had, tender beyond belief, with a flavor that was both familiar and strange. When I asked her how she did it, she smiled and said only that proper preparation is everything and that patience yields rewards in the kitchen, as in life. "I have eaten at the best restaurants in New York and Philadelphia, but I still crave the food served at the Blackwood table." Jenkins worked at the Blackwood house for only 3 months before leaving. "I told Miss Margaret that I needed to go home to take care of my sick mother," she said. "The truth is, I hated the place, especially the basement. I wasn't allowed to go down there, but I had to get some preserves when Miss Ruth was out. The shelves were full of jars, but they didn't have what you'd expect. I didn't want to look closely, but what I saw didn't look like any fruit or vegetable I'd ever seen. I left the next day and never went back." As 1,896 drew closer, the rate of disappearances sped up. 4 men went missing after staying at the Blackwood house between January and September of that year. Local store owners started to notice strange buying patterns that were different from what they had seen in the past. Ruth Blackwood's special order from Harper's Ferry Apothecary in July 1896 was very revealing. The partial receipt found in the apothecary's records lists compounds that had real medical uses, but when mixed together and in certain amounts, they could make people very sleepy. The receipt from the apothecary says, "For treatment of Miss Ruth's continued nervous condition as prescribed." There was no doctor's prescription, and Dr. Lambert's records don't say anything about treating Ruth for any nervous disorder. The sisters' business kept doing well. even though the economy was bad in most of the area in the mid-1890 seconds. The sisters' business kept doing well even though the economy was bad in the area in the middle of the 1890 seconds. Bank records show regular deposits, often in cash, that are much higher than what their documented occupancy rates would suggest. During this time, they bought a lot of important things, like new kitchen appliances, better plumbing fixtures, and a specially made ice box from a company in Philadelphia that, according to the shipping manifest, was made to keep temperatures low enough for long-term storage of perishable items. The sisters might have kept doing what they were doing all summer long if it hadn't been for the arrival of a certain guest on the 18th of September 1896, a man who signed the guest register as Dr. Ephraim Samuels arrived on the evening train from Baltimore. He said he was a dental surgeon moving to Martinsburg to start a practice. The register says that Dr. Samuels paid for a full week's stay in advance, which would have been a lot of money in cash. He was given the blue room on the second floor, which had a view of the garden and the back of the house. The sisters had no way of knowing that this man was not Dr. Samuels. Later, county records showed that the real Dr. Ephraim Samuels had died in Baltimore 3 months earlier. James Pinkerton, a private detective hired by the family of Howard Phillips, the businessman who went missing in February 1893, was the man who came to Blackwood House that September night. Pinkerton came to Harper's Ferry after months of looking into the case and finding a pattern of disappearances linked to the boarding house. He pretended to be Dr. Samuels for 3 days, eating with the sisters and watching what they did. In his personal journal, which was later found in his belongings in Baltimore, he wrote, "The oldest sister doesn't say much during meals, but she always watches. The middle sister keeps up a pleasant conversation while watching how people react to the food. The youngest sister serves each dish herself, always waiting for guests to take the first bite before going back to the kitchen. The meals are amazing. Maybe too amazing. The evening wine has a strange aftertaste that I have been careful to only pretend to drink." Pinkerton's journal entries show that he is getting more and more worried about his 3-day stay. Miss Ruth said that the roast for dinner on the second night was locally sourced game. The texture was different from any venison or rabbit I've ever had. The sisters watched closely as Mr. Carrington from Richmond ate 2 large portions with obvious pleasure. I claimed to have a headache and ate very little. Mr. Carrington became noticeably sleepy during dessert, and Miss Eleanor helped him to his room. When I asked about him at breakfast, I was told he had checked out before dawn to catch the early train. His last entry, dated the 21st of September 1896, says, "I am now sure of my suspicions. I have been watching the basement windows from the garden. There are strange things visible. A metal table with a drainage system, large preservation containers along the walls, and hooks in the ceiling with a pulley system. I will put my plan into action tonight. If I do not report to the Baltimore office by noon tomorrow, Agent Thompson should make backup plans." On the night of September 21, Pinkerton put his plan into action to find out what happened to guests who never left. After dinner, he pretended to be more drunk than usual by slurring his words and having trouble getting up the stairs to his room. The sisters helped him get to bed, and Margaret told him that a good night's sleep will set everything right. The Baltimore police received Pinkerton's report, which was then sealed until it was found in 1962. Pinkerton said that he waited until around midnight when he heard footsteps in the hallway. He opened the door and saw Margaret and Eleanor come in with what he called a big canvas sheet, a few lengths of rope, and a bunch of knives and other tools that made him worry. Pinkerton, who hadn't eaten or drunk the drugged food or wine but had quietly thrown it away, confronted the women. The fight that followed wasn't written down in detail because the pages with the information were taken out of his report before it was sealed. What we do know is that Pinkerton left Harper's Ferry suddenly the next morning and went back to Baltimore, where he filed his report and then disappeared from history. A single paragraph from Pinkerton's report gives us a hint about what might have happened during that confrontation. When questioned directly about the fate of Mr. Plated, Phillips and the others, the elder Miss B exhibited no shame or denial. She stated with perfect composure that waste is a sin, and that men of means who travel alone are seldom immediately missed. When I suggested that authorities would be interested in her philosophy, She indicated that her family's connections would prevent any serious inquiry, as had been the case previously. The look in her eyes convinced me that removing myself from the premises immediately was the wisest course of action. Even more disturbing is a note in the report's margin that Pinkerton apparently added later. Miss R appeared in doorway during confrontation, carried large cleaver, smiled in manner most unsettling, suggested I might contribute to the household in ways other than financial. Elder sister ordered her to return to kitchen. Believe my survival due solely to precaution of informing Baltimore office of my whereabouts and suspicions before arrival. The Pinkerton Detective Agency's internal records, which were only partially open to researchers in 1967, include a strange entry from the 23rd of September, 1896. Agent Pinkerton returned from Harper's Ferry assignment, submitted written report and verbal briefing, exhibited unusual agitation, requested immediate reassignment to Western Territories. Request granted. File sealed by order of senior management. 3 days after Pinkerton left, the Jefferson County Advocate ran a small notice that said, "The Blackwood sisters have closed their boarding house indefinitely because they need to deal with family matters." The house stayed empty for several months before a family from Washington, D.C. bought it, who said they found the place in perfect shape, as if it had been cleaned thoroughly before they left. Edward Collins, the real estate agent who handled the sale, later recalled, "The house was spotless, unnaturally so for a building that had been vacant for months. No dust, no cobwebs. The basement had been completely whitewashed, floor to ceiling, and smelled strongly of lye. The kitchen had all new equipment, perfectly clean pots and pans that looked as though they'd never been used. Most strange was the garden. It had been dug up entirely, and the soil replaced with fresh earth." When I asked about this, the neighbor said the sisters had engaged in a flurry of activity just before leaving, working day and night in the garden. Said they'd mentioned something about enriching the soil before departure. Collins added a detail that he had not shared publicly before his interview with Professor Whitaker. The new owners discovered something unusual during renovation, several months after moving in. When removing wallpaper in the dining room, they found what appeared to be a ledger or accounting book concealed within the wall. They contacted me, knowing I had handled the sisters' affairs. The book contained entries that made little sense, lists of names, with dates and amounts, but also weights and what appeared to be evaluations of quality. Terms like prime, select, and standard appeared next to some names. I advised them to destroy the book, which they did. Some things are better left unexamined, particularly in a house where one must continue to live. The sisters themselves seemed to disappear. There is no record of their leaving in the local transportation logs. The post office didn't get a forwarding address. Their large account at the Harper's Ferry Bank was closed, and the money was moved to a Philadelphia-based organization called the Shepherd Sisters Investment Trust. The only possible sighting comes from a porter at the Baltimore train station who told police in October 1896 that he had helped 3 older women traveling with a lot of luggage, including several large trunks that needed 2 men to move, board a train to Philadelphia. He remembered them well because the youngest had a strange intensity to her gaze that made me uneasy, and the middle one insisted on handling certain small cases herself, saying they held fragile items. The porter's statement, which was part of the Phillips family's private investigation, contains a disturbing detail. One of the trunks was damaged during loading, and the corner broke open slightly. I noticed a strange smell and offered to fix it, but the eldest lady firmly refused. She stood in front of me to block my view of the contents, but I saw what looked like glass jars or containers inside, carefully packed in straw. The youngest sister whispered something to her that I couldn't hear, and they both looked at me in such a way that I felt it best to finish my duties and get away from them as soon as possible. The story of the Blackwood house faded from people's minds for almost 50 years. It was only brought up now and then in conversations about businesses that used to be in the town. The sisters left at a time when Harper's Ferry was going through a tough economic time, and people had more important things on their minds. The house changed hands a few times. County records show that it changed hands 3 times between 1897 and 1923. Each time, the owners had lived there for less than 5 years. A strange pattern emerges in the reasons for these sales. Each family said they wanted to look for work elsewhere or go back to family in more populated areas. None of them said they were unhappy with the property, but none of them stayed long enough to really get to know the community. Henry Goodwin bought the house in 1912 and sold it again in 1916. He later told his grandson, "There was nothing wrong with the house itself. It was well built and had beautiful views. But it never felt right. My wife said she could hear sounds in the walls at night, like something moving or scratching. The kids wouldn't play in the basement because it smelled wrong and made them sick." I'm not superstitious, but even I had to admit there was something off about the place. We never talked about it openly. We just decided one day it was time to move on. Questions about the Blackwood house didn't come up again until 1953, when Professor James Whitaker started looking into businesses in Jefferson County after the Civil War. Whitaker, a careful historian who was especially interested in how the war changed local economies, found the sisters' story almost by accident. He found a bunch of strange purchase orders from a chemical supply company in Baltimore in the basement of the Jefferson County Courthouse. The orders, which were placed between 1892 and 1896, listed substances that didn't seem useful around the house, but were known to have sedative effects when taken in small amounts. The chemical orders included chloral hydrate, a sedative that was easy to find at the time but not often bought in large amounts by regular people. There were also a number of preservatives, chemicals used to tan leather, and substances that could effectively hide the natural taste of food when added in small amounts. Whitaker's interest made him do more research. He found the journal of Dr. Morris Fletcher, the local doctor who worked at the boarding house while it was open. Fletcher wrote in an entry from October 1896, not long after the sisters left, "I looked at the basement room at the request of the new owners. There was evidence of extensive cleaning, but some traces remain. The drain in the floor shows signs of frequent use. The hooks in the ceiling are not consistent with normal food preparation. I have advised the new owners to seal the room completely. Some things are best left alone." A later entry in Fletcher's journal says, "Mr. Collins has asked me about some stains he found under the recently removed floorboards in the basement. I told him that the discoloration is probably caused by mineral deposits from being close to the river. This answer seemed to make him happy, but I'm not sure it's right. In a small community like ours, some questions are better left unasked." Most telling is an entry from December 1896, which Fletcher apparently wrote after drinking what he called perhaps more brandy than is advisable for a man of my years. He wrote, "The more I think about what I saw in the Blackwood basement, the more disturbed I become. The way the equipment is set up suggests a purpose I dare not name. The drainage system, the hooks, the table with its channels and collection basin, all suggest activities that civilized minds refuse to think about. And yet, I cannot ignore the link between guests who were never seen to leave and the exceptional meals for which the establishment was known. God forgive me for even thinking such thoughts." Whitaker got in touch with the descendants of people who lived in Harper's Ferry at the time because of this discovery. He started to put together a timeline of disappearances that matched up with certain entries in the Blackwood House guest register through these interviews. It was noted that each missing person had paid their bill and left, always within 3 days of arriving and always after having dinner with the sisters. Whitaker's investigation took an unexpected turn when he found Martha Simmons, whose grandmother had worked as a maid at Blackwood House. Simmons talked about her grandmother in an interview from 1961. She said, "She wouldn't talk about it much, but sometimes after a few glasses of blackberry wine, she'd say things that didn't make sense to me as a child. About how she wasn't allowed in the basement after certain guests had checked out. About stains on linens that Miss Eleanor insisted on washing herself. About smelling something like a butcher shop coming from the kitchen when she arrived early one morning, though Miss Ruth claimed to be preparing a special breakfast." What was most disturbing was Simmons's memory of something her grandmother saw in the summer of 1896. Grandmother said she came to work earlier than usual one day and saw Miss Ruth in the garden behind the house. Said she was burying something wrapped in cloth. When grandmother approached, Miss Ruth straightened up quick and said she was just planting new herbs for the kitchen. But grandmother said there was a smell, and the cloth was stained dark. Miss Ruth gave her an extra $1 that week and told her not to come so early again. Simmons also told a story her grandmother had only told once when she was dying in 1932. Grandmother said that once, when cleaning the dining room after a special dinner party, she found what looked like a small bone under the table. It didn't look like chicken or beef. It looked more like a finger joint. When she showed it to Miss Eleanor, thinking it might be important, Miss Eleanor quickly took it and said it was just part of the special roast. Then Miss Ruth came in from the kitchen and whispered something to Miss Eleanor. They both looked at grandmother in a way that scared her badly. She said Miss Ruth told her, "Some secrets are best kept by those who wish to keep breathing." Grandmother never spoke of it again until she was dying and felt she needed to unburden her soul. Whitaker's research found a possible link to 3 women who opened a small restaurant in Allentown, Pennsylvania in 1897 called the Shepherd Sisters. The business was open for about 2 years before it suddenly closed after a customer died for no apparent reason. According to local news reports, the customer got sick suddenly after eating alone at the business. Mary, Elizabeth, and Caroline Shepherd are listed as the owners of the Shepherd Table in the 1897 Allentown City Directory. Whitaker wrote in his research journal that the image is not clear enough for positive identification. The resemblance is striking, especially in the case of the youngest, who has the same distinctive gaze that many Harper's Ferry residents described when talking about Ruth Blackwood. A review of the Shepherd Table, published in the Allentown Morning Call in December 1897, sounds a lot like descriptions of the Blackwood House. The establishment offers cuisine of remarkable quality, particularly the roasted meats, which achieve a tenderness and flavor that larger restaurants cannot match. A picture in a local business association publication shows 3 women who look like they are about the same age as the Blackwood sisters would have been at that time. The 3 sisters who run the place keep it classy, but some might find it strange that the youngest sister watches diners so closely. Gentlemen who eat alone are given special attention and are often invited to try dishes that aren't on the regular menu. The restaurant closed because of a death in March 1899. Whitaker found police reports that said George Harrington, a businessman, was found dead in his hotel room the morning after eating at the Shepherd Table. The coroner's report said the cause was acute gastric distress of unknown origin. However, a note in the medical examiner's personal papers said that possible poisoning cannot be ruled out, though no known toxin presents this particular pattern of symptoms. By the time the police wanted to talk to the Shepherd sisters about Harrington's last meal, they had already closed their restaurant and left Allentown. The newspaper only said that they had relocated to pursue opportunities elsewhere. There was no address to send mail to. Whitaker followed a path from Allentown to similar places in different cities. He stayed in a boarding house in Rochester, New York, from 1900 to 1902, a small hotel in Cleveland, Ohio, from 1903 to 1905, and a restaurant in Chicago, Illinois, from 1906 to 1908. In each place, the same thing happened. 3 women ran a restaurant known for its great food. Then men started disappearing for no reason, and finally, the restaurant closed and moved. Whitaker's research benefited greatly from the Chicago connection. From 1906 to 1908, city directories said that a restaurant called the Sisters' Table was open on the near north side. 3 women who called themselves the Shepherd Sisters owned the business. Their names were Mary, Elizabeth, and Caroline. Their ages were about the same as the Blackwood sisters if they had taken on new identities. The Chicago Tribune gave the restaurant a good review in December 1906, praising its great food, especially the house specialties of roasts and stews. The youngest sister reportedly prepares these dishes according to old family recipes. The tenderness of the meat is remarkable, achieving a quality that few professional establishments can match. Whitaker's 1962 interview with a former waiter at the Sisters' Table was more revealing. The man, then in his 70s, recalled, "The place was unusual, not like other restaurants where I'd worked. The sisters kept to themselves. The kitchen was strictly off-limits to staff, except for the one busboy they allowed to help with heavy lifting. They had a special room in the back that was always locked. Once a week, usually late Tuesday nights, deliveries would arrive, large ice boxes that the youngest sister would inspect carefully before they were taken to that back room. The waiter continued. There was a private dining room where special guests ate by invitation only, always men dining alone, usually well-dressed businessmen or travelers. The sisters would serve them personally, no wait staff allowed. Sometimes those gentlemen would look a bit unsteady when leaving, like they'd had too much to drink, though I never saw excessive alcohol being served. The youngest sister, Caroline they called her, would often help them into cabs, saying they needed assistance returning to their hotels. Strange thing was, a couple of times guests who left like that came back the next day looking confused, saying they had no memory of leaving the night before. In 1908, Chicago police records had a report about an investigation into the disappearance of William Carver, a Kansas City cattle buyer who was last seen going into the sisters' table for dinner on April 17, 1908. The investigation came to an end when the restaurant closed and the owners left the city before being questioned. A note in the file says that during an inspection of the empty building, it was found that the basement area had been changed in strange ways. Detective Michael Sullivan, who was in charge of the investigation, wrote a personal note in the file. The basement had a custom drainage system and signs of regular hosing down. There were large hooks mounted in the ceiling beams. The floor had just been covered with new concrete, but core samples taken from several areas show possible blood residue in deeper layers. Businesses nearby reported strange trash disposal habits. Sisters never used regular collection services, but took out the trash themselves late at night. Sullivan's last comment in the file reads, "Similar pattern to Rochester and Cleveland cases. Same 3 women, same type of establishment, same customer demographic targeted. Evidence suggests organized, methodical operation rather than crimes of opportunity. Recommend coordination with authorities in previous locations, though suspect subjects have already relocated beyond our jurisdiction." The trail gets harder to follow after Chicago. Whitaker's notes hint at possible links to places in Detroit from 1909 to 1911, Buffalo from 1912 to 1914, and finally Pittsburgh from 1915 to 1917. In each case, the pattern stayed the same. 3 women, great food, people going missing, and sudden moves. The Pittsburgh connection is especially interesting because it marks the end of the trail. The family table was a small restaurant in the Oakland neighborhood from 1915 to 1917. City records show that 3 women who called themselves the Wilson sisters, Jane, Anne, and Martha, owned it. However, the physical descriptions of the women who ran the sisters' table in Chicago matched those of the Wilson sisters very closely in business license applications. In June 1917, the Pittsburgh Press reported on the sudden death of Martha Wilson, the youngest sister. She was known as the culinary genius whose recipes made the family table a must-visit for people looking for great food. The death was said to be caused by complications from the flu, even though the Spanish flu pandemic had not yet reached Pittsburgh at that time. Dr. Errol Jenkins, a Pittsburgh doctor who cared for Martha Wilson during her last illness, wrote a memoir that gives a more detailed account. In a privately published book of memories, Jenkins wrote, "The case of Miss Wilson remains one of the most disturbing of my career. Her symptoms did not fit with any known disease process: progressive paralysis, cognitive decline, and eventually, respiratory failure. Her sisters refused to let her go to the hospital, insisting on home treatment only. What was most strange was their refusal to let me look at her food or medication. The older sister suggested that Miss Wilson's condition might be the result of occupational exposure to certain chemical compounds used in their culinary business. I suspect a case of accidental self-poisoning, possibly from substances used in food preservation, though the sisters would not go into detail about their methods. The restaurant shut down for good after Martha died. The 2 other sisters were never heard from again." A short notice in the Pittsburgh real estate section said that all of the sisters' business assets had been sold and the money given to the Red Cross for the war effort. The sisters had returned to their family home in New England. Whitaker's note suggests that Martha Wilson was actually Ruth Blackwood, and that her death marked the end of the sisters' activities. If the pattern holds, Ruth would have been about 54 years old in 1917. This is still young, but it fits with a life of stress and possible exposure to dangerous chemicals used in their work. It is still not clear what happened to Margaret and Eleanor, if they were the other Wilson sisters. Whitaker's research suggests that they may have moved to a small town in Vermont or New Hampshire after they retired, using money they had saved over the years to live comfortably without drawing attention to themselves. Whitaker went missing in March 1968 while looking through records in the basement archives of the Chicago Historical Society. On a table, his research materials were neatly arranged, and there was a half-written note that said, "I believe I am being." But the sentence was never finished. The Chicago police did a quick investigation and decided that Whitaker probably had a medical emergency while working alone and then got lost. The police never found his body, so they classified the case as a missing person case instead of a suspected murder. Even though Whitaker's hat, coat, and briefcase were still at his desk and the weather records show that it was well below freezing on the day he went missing, this conclusion was reached. In 1969, a clerk at the Historical Society reported finding something strange while reorganizing the storage area where Whitaker had been working. This was an interesting footnote to Whitaker's disappearance. There was a small leather-bound notebook that didn't belong to the collection tucked between two archived ledgers. There was a list of names and dates from 1893 to 1917 inside, along with notes about quality, tenderness, and flavor. 3 days after it was turned in, the Chicago Police Department's evidence locker lost the notebook. The clerk who found it is said to have retired early and moved to Arizona soon after. Within days of Whitaker's disappearance, federal authorities took his research. Most of it is still classified, and access won't be allowed until 2023. What little has been made public gives us tantalizing but incomplete looks at a case that has been going on for decades and may involve more than one jurisdiction. The few researchers who were allowed to look at Whitaker's files have more questions than answers. Dr. Elizabeth Chambers of Columbia University was one of these researchers. In 1965, she wrote a carefully worded paper that said the Blackwood case was part of a pattern of behavior that may have happened in many places in the eastern United States between 1870 and 1915. It always involved female boarding house owners, always targeted wealthy male travelers, and always had an unusual focus on the food that was served to the victims. Chambers' paper doesn't make any direct accusations, but it strongly suggests that the Blackwood sisters, and maybe others who use similar methods, were behind a lot of disappearances that happened over many years. It's most troubling that she thinks the sisters may have had friends or apprentices who kept up their work long after the original criminals would have been too old to do it. In 1966, a journalist looking into a string of disappearances in Minneapolis found records of a small restaurant that had been open there from 1920 to 1922. This was an unexpected boost for the theory. Two older women and a younger woman who said she was their niece ran the business, which was called Aunt Martha's Kitchen. The journalist's work was never published because he had a stroke while doing research and died before he could finish it. People still wonder what really happened at the Blackwood house. The physical proof is long gone. If the sisters had lived full lives, they would have died before 1950. It is now impossible to get a legal answer. But there are still pieces left. Ledgers showing strange purchases. A guest register with names that match missing persons reports from faraway cities. A doctor's cryptic journal entry. And the unfinished research of a professor who disappeared while trying to put these different pieces together. The cookbook found during renovations to the Blackwood house in 1972 is probably the most disturbing thing. The handwritten book, which was found sealed inside a wall cavity, had recipes written in Ruth Blackwood's unique handwriting. Most of the dishes were normal for the time, but some pages were missing. The secret is in the preparation. Patience yields tenderness. What seems unpalatable can be made delicious with the right technique. This was written on the inside cover of the cookbook, which was one of the things that the federal government took. No one knows where it is right now, but there are rumors that it is in a special collection at the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, where profilers study it to learn more about the psychology of killers who work over long periods of time and in different jurisdictions. One recipe that the contractor who found it copied before the police got there gives us a disturbing look at Ruth Blackwood's cooking style. It is called Special Roast, and it has regular cooking instructions, but it also has a note that says, "Subject must be properly prepared. Soak for at least 6 hours in the solution described on the missing page." The quality of the final result depends entirely on the care taken during preparation and the choice of proper subjects. Those who are very active make tough, stringy results, while those who are sedentary and eat a lot of rich foods make the most tender portions. Since Whitaker went missing, there have been a few times when people have tried to reopen the Blackwood case. Each has run into problems with the administration or lost important paperwork at the right time. The most recent attempt, which began in 1966 by a true crime writer, ended when the writer had a debilitating stroke before finishing his research. Historians in Harper's Ferry now only mention the Blackwood sisters in passing, usually when talking about businesses that were in the town in the late 1800s. Tour guides sometimes talk about how the boarding house used to be known for its great food, but they never mention the disappearances or the investigations that followed. There have been many renovations to the building itself. When the house was being worked on in 1923, the basement room that Dr. Fletcher wrote about was sealed off and is still not accessible. The current owners say nothing strange has happened, but one former tenant told the Jefferson County Historical Society that the house feels strange at night, not haunted exactly, more like it's remembering something it doesn't want to share. In a 2002 interview, Park Ranger David Morris, who gives historical tours of Harper's Ferry, said that some parts of the town's history are left out of official stories on purpose. "We focus on John Brown's raid, the Civil War, and the area's natural beauty. People come to see the history and the scenery, not to hear about the darker parts. Local historians know about the Blackwood case, but we don't talk about it much. Some stories are better left untold," Morris said, sounding a little reluctant. There are still people in town whose grandparents or great-grandparents knew the Blackwood sisters. They don't like to talk about it, though. People seem to think that whatever happened in that house should stay in the past. Richard and Susan Thornton, the current owners of the old Blackwood house, bought it in 1998 without knowing anything about its past. Susan Thornton said in an interview in 2005, "We found out about the sisters after we'd been living here for about a year. A neighbor mentioned it casually, as though we should already know. We did some research at the Historical Society, but there wasn't much information available." Richard Thornton added, "We've never experienced anything unusual in the house. Well, except for the garden. Nothing grows in certain spots, no matter what we plant or how we treat the soil. And there's a corner of the basement that always feels colder than the rest of the house, even in summer, but that's probably just poor insulation in an old building." In 2009, renovation work on an old restaurant building in Pittsburgh revealed a sealed wall cavity that held several glass-preserving jars. This was an interesting twist on the Blackwood story. The contents were so badly damaged after almost 100 years that they couldn't be identified and were thrown away as biological waste. But one jar had a small metal thing in it, a pocket watch with the initials HP carved into the case. According to records, the building used to be home to the Family Table Restaurant, which the Wilson sisters ran in 1917. The Pittsburgh Historical Society said they own the watch, and it is still in their collection. There is no official link between Howard Phillips, the first known victim of the Blackwood sisters, and them. The curator of the Historical Society only said, "Some artifacts raise more questions than they answer, and maybe that's how it should be." A note found among Professor Whitaker's things after he went missing may be the best epitaph for the Blackwood case. There was a single sentence on the back of a train ticket to Chicago. "The most terrifying thing about evil is not how big it is, but how easily it can look like service, comfort, or a well-set table with a hot meal waiting." People who visit Harper's Ferry today walk right by the old Blackwood house without even looking at it. The rivers keep meeting each other, and the mountains stand silent, holding secrets that have been buried for a long time. And maybe Ruth Blackwood's recipe book is in an archive somewhere, with pages missing that have instructions that were never meant to be followed again. For those who study these things, there is one interesting footnote. Between 1897 and 1915, local newspapers in cities across the eastern United States sometimes wrote about restaurants, boarding houses, and small hotels, where the owners were known for their great cooking and attentive service. These businesses were open for a short time, usually less than 3 years, and then closed without any explanation. In each place, the pattern of disappearances continued. Men who were traveling and were last seen enjoying a hearty meal before disappearing completely from history. The sisters who served more than dinner may have left Harper's Ferry in 1896, but the hunger that drove them may have found new kitchens, tables, and guests for many years after that. "When the pantry is empty, it is time to set a new table," said the last entry in Ruth Blackwood's kitchen ledger. That table may even be being set right now in America.